Okay, so if you don't mind, we're going to start. Some people might arrive yet, but we need to start somewhere. So yeah, my first thing is apologies for the clickbait title because I needed to cut it short for the slides. But in general, I wanted to explain you more or less the scenario that we face on one specific project, which has many sub-projects, let's say, but especially for you to know how the module can be used and the good things that it has, but also the issues you might face the moment you deviate from the normal use case. Well, I should maybe start. Okay, I'm Daniel. I'm from Cádiz, but I live here in Seville. I actually studied here on this very same university, on this very same classroom, so this is very weird, exactly like 10 years later, almost perfect. So yeah, I started working on Drupal in 2012, approximately, and then I switched to Kokomo at 2015, and since then I've worked on a lot of projects. You can see me as the Pavon on Drupal.org, but since there are some social networks imploding, then I didn't put them, and I'm not discussing Drupal too much, but anyway, you can ask me or on the normal account of the company. I faced a lot of projects, but this one was very unique. It was already a legacy project that came from another previous legacy project on another technology. It moved to Drupal, but eventually they faced certain issues. This project, normally we work with the client in the content editors so that they use paragraphs all the time for almost anything that composes the pages, except of course header and footer, but they are not dealing with blocks or similar. They just use their paragraphs, a list of components we provide for them. And there were certain problems with how they set it up at the very beginning. There was the need to structure the content in multiple columns, like one column layout, two column layouts, 3 or 4, the typical. And on those scenarios, the solution they took, which was correct by the time, but of course, as anything, when time passes, you start to see the issues. They started using paragraphs normally with certain extensions in order to make them more usable and collapsible and etc. Or paragraph extensions like the editor enhancements or modules, paragraph remotes or similar. The problem is they started to face a lot of issues with the nesting of the paragraphs, especially in combination with revisions. I think I do have that. I mean, there's also the accordions, of course, because you have the normal layout that let us suppose the layout of 2 columns. It has the field for the left column and for the right column. And then you need to add paragraphs within. And then you need to add, for instance, if you want to add an accordion, then you also need the accordion child. And we start finding some nesting like 3 level depth, 4 or even more. So that triggers some issues, as I was mentioned, with the storage on the database because of entity revisions, and it was starting to become somewhat of a mess, both for content editors and for us. And there were also a lot of visual options. I didn't mention it before, but it was a multi-site. And each one of the sites had its own thing, its own features, its own components, and everything else. And each one of the clients requested something differently, so it started to deviate a lot and multiply the complexity. In that complexity, we also had, of course, the customizations that they wanted on every specific component. So there were some components that needed some colors. I mean, this is in German, I didn't translate it for this slide. I copied the chunks of it. So the image position as well, or if the image should behave differently, and this all started to pile up. And the way we needed to maintain the multi-site was also tricky in terms of how we manage the configuration and, of course, the number of fields. So this eventually became an issue, and they gave us a change of recreating the site, almost all the sites, but in a planned manner. So we left the old site living for a while and preparing like a profile for all of them in order to install it. We started then checking solutions for these problems in terms of layouting and components. And I put 4 options here, but there might be far too many, or this might include even a lot of suite of paragraphs, of modules for paragraphs. So, for instance, on another project, we use classic paragraphs in order for them to be able to customize the behavior. But that also meant that we needed a field for classic paragraphs, which had a lot of multiple combinations that we needed to align with frontend in terms of the CSS per component. The problem, this doesn't solve any layouting, just the number of fields. You can reduce some and maybe play with the CSS and give some customization. So we needed something more. It's not only that. With Layout Builder, it was also another of the options. But as I mentioned, we were using extensively paragraphs. Everyone knew them. Everyone was using them, and also not just the content editors, but even the client when they needed to actually use the tool. So we didn't want to change it that much, and Layout Builder would need to, for them to know exactly how blocks work and not to break the site if they do something wrong. So it might be more difficult to explain and to do that change. Maybe on other projects that might be a choice, but not for us. So we also had on another one of our projects, totally separate these two I mentioned, from the multi-site, a JavaScript visual tool that was really correct in fixing the issue with the layouts so that the content editors were able to choose, but it was not complete and we needed to add a lot of features in order to get it ready for the project. We discarded for now that option. I flagged it on green as it was one of the options, but we decided to take a look and broaden the scope to find alternatives, especially country alternatives that could be maintained and we could reuse and extend. So we continued, but besides that, there's another option, like I mentioned, paragraph editor extensions or paragraph view mode. There are a lot of modules to improve paragraphs, but they didn't fix all the issues we had, all the combinatory that we wanted to achieve. So I kept looking, and there was another option. There might be far too many. It depends. Maybe your path is different. But in our case, in 2021, more or less, when the project was in development, or the initial profile that later was rolled out to the others, we found that the version 1 was deprecated and the code was then rewritten entirely. And so we proceeded to check the version 2. The moment we installed it locally, it looked very promising, but there was a disclaimer here. Maybe it doesn't show because I took this from Web Archive. For the record, now it's usable on live sites. It has the green color and the shield and all the any guarantee you can have that it works. On a normal use case scenario, of course, I will explain so. So the version 2, we decided to install it and see how it looked. I'll explain more or less what we saw, but in general, I really liked it and started asking around if this was an option, if everyone agreed, our clients as well, and did a minor demo. So more or less, everyone seemed to agree, but there were some challenges that we needed to face. So for now, I will do a minor example as if it were simply test, so you can check it the moment you go to your home or whatever you want to check. You can use simply test and install the module or locally, and then you could follow these very same steps. These are the ones I followed in order to make things usable from the get-go. First step, of course, we need some paragraphs to use, otherwise we don't have nothing. In this scenario, I created an image and a text paragraph, no major complexity. I added to make the image one an image field, to the text a text field, nothing major. But on the layouting, then this is the first thing you need to do for paragraph layouts to properly start working. You would need a paragraph that would act as the section that we call layout, very original, and this is the part that you need to flag. This is a paragraph behavior, and that is the way that layout paragraphs, the module, uses to extend the functionality of paragraphs. Those can be enabled or disabled depending on the paragraph type. This is the paragraph type, as you mentioned, the view, the configuration menu, and you are able to select the layouts that you want to provide on this container of sorts. Because you could maybe have a specific container that is only for the 2 columns, another for 3 or 4, etc. You can more or less split the functionality. But in my case, it was enough, one single container and all of them, or just all the ones I'm going to use in the entire site. As I wanted to highlight here is using layout API, so this uses the normal discovery system of Drupal in order to define your own layouts. Maybe you need to do something in front end to prepare the templates properly, but the default ones should be fairly ready to use as is. So we don't need any field on the layout for now. Maybe you can customize later. You of course need some content type where to place the paragraphs. That's normally basic. And in this scenario, in the normal scenario, we would use the entity reference field as usual to add the paragraphs. But now we need to decide and do exactly the integration of layout paragraphs. Here I mentioned that it's option 1, but it all depends on your use case. On our scenario, I started testing this by going to the manage font display and then using the widget of layout paragraphs. One of the things that I do recommend a lot is make it mandatory so that you need the container first and then anything within. So it's not chaos that you have the components outside. I mean, maybe you are able to hold it, but in my case, I really wanted to have wrappers for everything. Let us proceed, and then you can see right away on your admin section, on the node edit form, that the system is already in place, and you are able to edit the layouts. Whenever you click here in order to add a section, you have a pop-up, and then you can select the different layouts that you want to use, the same ones I highlighted before. This is really fancy, and I really like the editor because it allows you to edit the components, to copy them, to delete the entire layout, etc. For now, I will show how it is created. You have this plus button, which in this case I use it there, in order to add the list of paragraphs that you have. Disclaimer, all of them for now. We'll see more on that later. So let us suppose I add an image then there, an image paragraph, and then you will be able to edit it. I think there's a close button usually and a save button here, so but I probably cut them off. And that's mostly it. The problem, I already saw some things, so I will flag them for later. All this renderization of your components is done on the admin thing, so it's likely you don't have your styles from your normal thing. If you are maintaining your own admin theme, then maybe that's okay, and you are rendering all the pages with your theme. But in our scenario, it wasn't. We were using a normal admin theme, so a standard by default, not a customized by us, and only on the front end, let's say front end, on the node view is when we use our custom theme. So other thing I saw is that, okay, we are using this form for this instead of actually editing the components as usual. So I thought that maybe the translations could be an issue, because at some point I need to change the labels, and I'm not sure that I would be translating just one language or all of them, so that's something I wanted to clarify. The problem is, if you only change the font display and you don't change the node display, then you have this issue that it's rendering the entire layout with its children and also the paragraph separately. Because this for it would be a paragraph, and this would be another. So you need to change the node display, and this is something that is not avoidable, and is actually the normal usage. So you go, you change the render entity or whatever plugin you're using, and you go for the layout paragraph builder. And I also checked enable the checkbox. Here also it mentions it is experimental. Honestly, it's far stable. It's quite stable. There are some minor quirks. I'll explain them later. Usually when we are here, we say that all the modules are super cool and all are perfect. But of course, you will find minor issues the moment you have another module that has another thing and changes the behavior. So, but for now, this is basic. You add the experimental, you can configure the parent container, and then now it's rendered correctly. I know the example is not the best because we don't have many styles on the simply test like per se, but in this case, it is rendering with your styles. If you have a custom theme enabled, then you will have it here. Here you can see more or less the editor. I will flag that more on that button, and yeah, the GIF works. So I created an animation, so just to explain for you that, of course, you can drag and drop components, you can copy the layouts as well, and yeah, you save, close, whatever. You can drag and drop, you can edit, you can even have this. I don't have it on the slides, but you can have more than one paragraph field, so you have different layouts. Let's suppose you have the header, and the header works differently with another set of paragraphs. You could have then that field and this one. Normally, both should work correctly, and the layout should save separately. If you save the one above and you close the one above, should not affect the one below, normally, but it always depends. So the risks I saw, I already flagged them more or less. We have the issues with multilingual, translations, revisions, and moderation. And also what happens if they edit the layout in one place and then the other, because right now in the configuration, I put the form display, I changed the node form, but I also changed how the view display shows the paragraph. We have the editor. If we follow this straightforward, we have it on both sides, which is weird. So now let us limit it a little bit and what we decided. On our scenario, we were more or less lucky that, or we earned the trust, that the client more or less understood the limitations that we posed, because some of them might open the combinatory problem extensively. One of the issues is that, okay, for now we found out the translations possible issue. I mean, maybe it works perfectly, but we decided back then that on the front-end side, they would use the editor to edit it, but they would do the translations on the node edit form. So anything I configured before, we would remove it, and we would show only, I think it's on the next slide, but in general, I'm explaining all of this all together, so that we're using the normal edit form here with all the components listed, but step by step. As I mentioned before, first sections, then components within. So that was already cleared out, so that was one of our assumptions. Second one, the layouts. What happens then if I have the editor on the front end, but they go on the edit form and they mess it up? That might be an issue. So we added a hook and locked the access to it. It is never editable nor translatable on the edit form. So more topics. You need to control how to add the components, because if you go to the node edit form and the editor is not there, it will allow you to add normally paragraphs as usual. So you need to control on code the add more buttons and any way that you can add more paragraphs there. Normally, you can even use the configuration of the field itself to limit the number of paragraphs you want to see there. But it might be maybe too restrictive. So, but you could. There are certain form alter hooks or any other options to limit it, which is what we did, and we remove as well other paragraphs that had nothing to do with it. As I mentioned, if we have an accordion, I don't want it to add an accordion item alone. It needs a wrapper, a parent. So that should also be controlled. Other changes that we did is, this is something that by default is not on the module. The module provides certain options to extend it, such as the paragraph behavior, of course. There are certain events you can also attach to and do whatever changes you want. But on our scenario, we did it with another layout behavior, which is what the layout paragraph module uses within. As I mentioned before, you can enable or disable them on the paragraph type and also add certain configuration there. This is all rendered with Form API, so you can customize your behaviors however you please. With this behavior, let me check. Yeah, because that's another very similar. We have many behaviors. Yes, we try to limit so that, for instance, if you have an iframe or a paragraph with an iframe, a paragraph which embeds a view, or any sort of a scenario where you can't control how it is going to render on smaller scenarios, and it doesn't have even any sense, then you block it. And then you can more or less, if you enable it, we are locking only to those that are selected. Okay, another issue, well, not an issue, a challenge, but we needed to tackle it really early. This is one of the topics that we have had already on those sites. In order to render all the components on mobile, if you have 4 columns and you stretch it, at some point that is impossible to read. So the column agreed that when we switch to mobile, all the components will render as if it were one column. It makes everyone's life easier and everyone's, like the idea to understand much easier as well. Again, back with the image styles. Yes, one of the topics we needed to customize was how it was handled. In this, it depends a lot of your journey as well. It depends on your project and however you want to plan it. On our scenario, thankfully, maybe we don't need it any longer, so we'll eventually remove it, but Slick was present, and we were able to use one of its preprocesses to dynamically change the responsive image format. So when we're using, for instance, a component that you drag and drop directly without changing the view mode to one column to 2 columns, then we switch, for instance, for an image ratio that it was like for 12 columns, because we are using Bootstrap for the visual part. Instead, it goes to a more or less a size for 6 columns. And on that responsive image, since we need to consider the mobile scenario we mentioned above, when we switch to mobile, it renders fully. So right now, this would be like 3 columns, for instance, or 4, more or less. And then on mobile, it would take the full size. So we're using responsive image styles, but it is decided on the number of columns dynamically by our code, which checks the parent's layout, which one it is. If I didn't mention, the parent layout here, in order to fix the nesting problem we had, in this case, layout paragraphs store the information, or in general, the information of a paragraph behavior is stored on the third-party settings field of the paragraph. So that's what we need to read in order to know exactly which one is the parent. You need to actually check all the paragraphs and then load the third-party settings, find your UID, and then get it. It's more difficult in code than normally just getting who's the parent or loading the parent, but I mean, it's better for the nesting problems we have. So that said, I stop here far too long. Yeah, let us not complain about the use case or what we need to do exactly for it to work, but also let us provide something more to the client. Since we saw that the module was using already behaviors, and we saw it was a very good way to customize all the colors and everything else we discussed above, or before, we wanted to add some of them. We checked the module of layout paragraphs, we copied the idea, and we thought it was very useful to avoid that issue. We added some, for instance, on the layout themselves, so that we can maybe increase some backgrounds. Let us imagine you have a layout that can have a lot of components, and then you want to change the color, but you don't want all the components to be the color changed. You need the entire layout to be changed. And the margins also applicable to the layout, because sometimes there will be spaces between them. You cannot change all the components and expect that it will be entirely blue or whatever. So yeah, there are some properties in general that we can apply to the layouts, but we are extending paragraphs. The layout is a paragraph. We can do the same with the normal components. In this case, yeah, this is more or less an example of a behavior that we have like the width, and we can remove it entirely or just add some margins. And as I was mentioning, we can also extend it to the components themselves. Components, I mean paragraphs, and also add customizations. Although we also use paragraph view mode for view modes on the teaser, but there are also some options we have on some types of design, etc. As I mentioned, this is all Form API. You will likely have issues on Form API with the tabs and etc. rendering on the pop-up. There are some styles on the pop-up of layout paragraph when editing. You need to be very careful on the wrappers and the structure there, but the moment you more or less have something more usable, then stick with it or just find your way with the others. So yeah, here, going back to the topic, we have some options to customize. And for instance, we added also a behavior that allows us to control the color. And since this is Form API, I can maybe change the number of config that I want this component to have. For instance, I wanted to change the background color or the title, but maybe the teaser has this enabled, this one, but maybe it doesn't have a CTA or whatever. So you can more or less pick and choose whatever you want. This is all customizable. You create your own, and this is the same. This is also Form API, and you also customize it and how it should be stored. You need to be careful on the submission of the form, so the values are properly read and written. And yeah, this would be an example. You change the color, and then you see the color change and whatever. In this case, it's a teaser with a video. It's a bit more complex, but just for you to know an example. And the same with the CTAs, etc. Or you can change the styles or put them on different layouts, or use the layout for background CSS that maybe the client wanted. The moment you have a behavior, it's very easy because you then copy and change however you please. Now the issues, and the part I hope I'm really not going far too fast, but you can ask me later on the topics. Some issues with the layout on the editor. For instance, if you have a paragraph that needs to render a view, the view will need to render with a specific parameter, for instance, for the page, and it will also do Ajax requests if you enable Ajax on the pagination. Those things are likely not going to work on the editor normally, unless you spend a lot of time properly managing everything. So what we align more or less to save some time is like, okay, you add the view, but you just save and close, and that's it. Normally, you are not going to test the view on the editor. You save it, and that's all. On some other scenarios, I'll show you later, we put a message for the editor to know. More topics, sliders. The moment you have something on top, which as you saw, the editor is rendering on top because it has custom buttons, custom wrappers, and everything, then whenever you click somewhere, maybe your component will not track that click. So sliders will stop working. I mean, maybe they do a slide, but you cannot move it or drag and drop it. I mean, no, you can drag and drop, but you cannot slide it. So yeah, maybe some things you can also warn the editors or spend some time on that, but I'll just warn you about it. The typical issues, the editor should render on top, but if your component has, I know, a higher set index or whatever, it might not be clickable. And you need to be careful not to lose that button because it shows on top but not below. I'm not sure if there's a configuration for that because honestly, it would be really nice to have it on both. But yeah, it's a minor topic, not a problem. Yeah, topic with routings. Anything you do on the editor, I mean not anything, but the moment you save, will trigger, or even the pop-ups, will trigger, of course, Ajax requests. If you have any single issue on your code, the editor will not know what is going on. The Ajax will go, you will get a bad response, it will not re-render anything, no one knows anything. It stops saving and it stops working. So you need to be very careful. In some scenarios, and in order to avoid certain extra code from messing up, layout paragraphs render certain classes and has certain JavaScript events that you can attach to or do functionality with it. So for instance, we render this wrapper on top with this text like, okay, be careful, you added this component, but you need to save and close, as I mentioned before, so that they know. And that said, yeah, another of the possible challenges, not issues, that you might face is that at some point, if you want to attach an image, you might need to open a pop-up if you want to select a media for reusing media. The problem is you have a pop-up within a pop-up. The things start getting complex. Not just the layout of the form, the styles, which maybe, as you see, sometimes are a bit not entirely aligned. You need to style it as well separately. But yeah, there are some problems with it. On our case, we had issues with the media browser, but with Entity Browser, we were able to more or less control it, while at the same time limiting the types of media they were going to attach. Because you can tell them SVGs or images, but maybe videos you want to have it as a separate media. Thanks to the Entity Image Browser and have it prepared separately, and it was easy to more or less have a bit more control. And I think it renders again correctly. With media, there were some issues that we still need to properly find a patch for it, but just for you to know. And that is a tricky one, and that's funny. We mentioned that, of course, we can add the components, and that we are locking the components so that whenever you click on the plus icon, you can add a certain subset of the entire list of paragraphs you have. Problem is, what happens if they drag and drop a component for a layout that was correct, and then they move it to a wrong layout? That's the tricky part. So as I mentioned, there are JavaScript events you can react to and maybe warn the editor and tell them, okay, your call, I will not block you, do what you want, but be careful, because it might be rendering, for instance, these components should have the images big enough, because it's a gallery, you click on this one and it reloads the page, the image. But in this scenario, the images were wrong. So that is something we can warn them and at least tell them. And that's mostly it. Yeah, any questions for now, any ideas, suggestions, or any other user journey that you were able to fulfill with this model? I'm sorry if I went too fast. I started. Question?
Thank you for the talk. What I want to ask you is about if it's related to two questions. The first one is if you have experienced any advance in editing those paragraphs or line right in the layout. And the second one, if you are using this only to classify Drupal and to the correct thing, or you have experienced any advance using paragraphs
Okay, in terms of, I'll answer the second first, but we didn't use it in any sort of headless scenario. So that might be difficult because if you are using the editor and it's going to render on a whole different scenario, I don't know how would that behave. About the first question, could you repeat it again or rephrase it, just to be sure?
So I was asking about inline editing the paragraph right on the layout. Is that possible to work with that?
You mean like with quick edit or something similar and edit it directly? We haven't tested it because, yeah, the combination is even worse. Let's say it's another layer to maintain. But ideally, if you are careful enough with the theme head on and the editor shouldn't get in between with a set index problem or similar, ideally it should work, but I haven't tested. You're welcome. Any other question? Okay.
Next, sorry if I got it right. How do you manage the image formats? So you have 3 columns, image size are different. How do you manage this?
Yeah. I mean, it might not be the cleanest part, but I can enter in detail on the image formats. The responsive image style we use, the problem is we enter in a multiplicity case. If we have, for instance, an image style that the image format that is 16:9 or 1:1 ratio, we needed to create the responsive image format for that specific format in every single of the columns. So it's format in 12, 6 column, or 9 on 8, then 3 on 4, then I don't know, whatever it was. You need all the combinatory done because I need those responsive image styles to be switched directly by my coding. The problem is we switch it with the machine name and the number of columns that we have at the end. It's a bit of a workaround. There's no like plugin or something reusable there, but that's what we did because I needed a specific responsive image style for every specific combination so that in mobile they render in one column. So that's more or less the solution we took, but tricky.
Per process you control the...
Correct, thanks to Sleek, which provided the exact moment and the exact place where we can switch it. A pre-process Sleek, one of the pre-processes it has. If there's another way to do it without Sleek, it's a part I still want to research. We can get rid of Sleek.
But this is only for Sleek.
Yes, for any field that you use Sleek, correct. But for now we use Sleek. Oh no.
Okay, you also have images out of Sleek.
Yes, in the other scenarios, I still don't have a pre-process for that. The moment I have it, honestly, I'm removing Sleek because we are using for lazy loading, but our browser supports by default lazy loading already, so we can maybe get rid of one extra layer because there are many layers already. Okay, you're welcome. Anyone else?
First of all, sorry if I didn't understand something correctly or
Not at all.
whatever, but at the end, what I'm trying to understand is, apart from having the components, let's say, rendered in the part of the edit form, what is mainly the advantage from using some kind of layout builder, for example, that is going to have a more cleanest, at least visually, let's say, way than, for example, having these kind of components that we are, what I'm seeing from the presentation is that we have a lot of issues, challenges, we have a lot of maybe unresolved sections or parts that can be challenging for the development, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, those challenges didn't show up entirely altogether. So eventually it depends. I'm listing them all so that you are aware, but it depends on the versions as well. Sometimes when we updated something, then we had a new issue, but it was later on. But anyway, all the advantages that we had in terms of providing the editor a more visual, fancy look, which they appreciated a lot, because they don't get to like messing with a lot of paragraphs that need to collapse in order to be able to work with it and know exactly which one are they editing. Because if they copy, like all of them, they don't know exactly which position do they take in the visual part. And then it becomes tricky. If you have inline editing, it is far easier. But if you don't, then it's an advantage if they use the editor. But yeah, also cloning the entire layout, for instance, it's also very helpful when they need to repeat a lot of theses in different occasions. It's true that, as I mentioned, there are concerns, but they had so much power in a single tool on a single page that they really appreciated it. So it was more to also please the client and attract more clients, because the fancier you have the tools, you can also show them and, of course, bring more people on board. You're welcome. Okay, not sure if we have time, so any other topic, question? Maybe I should use the slides, so yeah, you know more or less where we are. Yeah, thank you for our Platinum sponsors and all the others. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. And yeah, there are two other, I will be with our colleagues on other talks that they will also be doing. So if you have any other question and I'm not around, I'll likely be around before or after this, or even on the talk. And that's all. So thank you very much.